Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval education, in particular the 15th century institutions, not just universities, but mostly. Just recently we made, as you know, some intense dive into essentially humanism, and so we highlighted the elite nature of education, most at least the one that really mattered eventually at an institutional level, in politics, in government, in administration. However, and we made some videos about this far away in time, far back in time, and looking especially about the literacy among the masses was actually increasing in the later Middle Ages, etc. The complexity of this ever more hierarchically stratified but still functional form of education. The interpretation can go two ways. Essentially, that the spread of literacy and education, etc., often, if not almost always, came at some point at the loss of some kind of primal meaning behind probably the traditional essence of what had historically been passed down. Again, we've seen it fairly well in that series about the history of historiography, especially for medievistics, where we highlighted a bit all this change through the lens of medievistics itself and how it formed throughout the centuries. On the other, you can look at the Middle Ages and realize that certain institutions that were surely in difficulty, think about the age of councils of the church, etc., with the papacy as much as the empire, had reduced themselves to a somehow regional dimension rather than at least the same level of universal reach that it had in the past, were, however, sponsoring some of the most important levels of education at the time, and in ways that were actually formative exactly to the end of that traditional worldview. And so the notion that the Middle Ages would have been an age of obscurantism, in which, for example, the church would have allegedly prevented people from being literate, schooled, educated, etc., is pretty much nonsensical throughout, by the way, all the medieval centuries, given that actually the greatest source of literacy promotion was the church itself. And naturally, as always, should distinguish also different countries where they had gotten to socially wise, what was the fabric properly of these communities, because obviously there were, again, large the majority of the population, of course, it was illiterate, but in particular certain parts of Europe that were, unironically, the ones that eventually led the attack towards the papal monarchy were still the ones that had sort of the worst in this comparison. And if anything, we'll have to stick a bit more to 15th and 16th century history to understand some crucial passages, not just through the Reformation, but even in this immediately previous generations. So this is a wide topic. Probably many of you are saying, oh no, Schwerpunkt, I don't like this, I want something else. I was tempted today to either respond some question and answer, send some question for the question and answer series, and or to comment on our recent survey of what kind of of era you among the major four the historical ones you would like me to increase the content on Schwerpunkt. It was an incredibly successful survey, at least considering the participation. I've gotten here in, I think, like 8 hours, over 400 votes, right? If you gave me likes as much as votes, with the same rate, at this point, the channel would explode. Literally, the proof, by the way, of what I'm saying at every channel update. Unfortunately, this is the potential that is there, but it is not exploited in the way it should. In any case, I'm glad that there is some greater participation. Also, I understand that you're probably coming back from vacations. The views are going to rise again, and everything is going to go back into place. Today we talk, as we were saying, about medieval universities, but also schools. All right, and the notion that these institutions would have been peripheral to society is quite erroneous. First of all, because society was, as we explained, hierarchically organized, which meant that it had probably also a center. There wasn't much just of a difference a vertical divide, but also a radius spread of this kind of idea that informed the entire system. And this is interesting because many of the ideas that sometimes we think would apply to this essentially already ancient regime dimension, because we're talking today essentially the 15th century, so we're after the late medieval crisis, would fundamentally, are in reality modeled after some of the most rigid and, in some cases, obscurantistic fringes of the ancient regime. By the time that the system was collapsing, mostly these are sort of Enlightenment narratives that malignated around probably the purpose of that type of sense of authority in education. There is no doubt that late medieval crisis sclerotized the system, and so what we call as the ancien regime, that actually was the one within also the third estate could develop. Eventually people could become more literate and so on, which is a bit like the paradox of anti-tradition, that it was fostered at least within a traditional reality that allowed people to have this kind of individual ideas. We're not even quite much, we're first of all very functional to the time beings when you contextualize them in the various times and places. But they were also sort of lighter in the Middle Ages. What in this sense a modernistic critic often misses is the fact that individual education, for example, is, say, obviously in line of theory great, because the more people know, the better we hope they can become. But in this sense, it doesn't depend on the quantity of education. First of all, there is an important traditional difference between form and substance. You can give a lot to learn, but not really a form through which to read this. Just given the terms of comparison, this is really typical of mass society in our world where, say, liberty is given like almost an infinite level of indulgency against any kind of regulation or / that you must impose at some point if it is real low. And of course, it's dictated by a higher and functional principle in that way, which is the same reason why, for example, education is compulsory. And so where's the limit there in practice? There is a huge hypocrisy that muds the water and is in general just for the sake of itself. But there is properly this other factor, is to say you can give so much education to someone, and a few people will, for different reasons that are mostly traditional, and that's what that element that we often confuse in terms of sort of everything that is just chronologically more recent is modern. Right? The things that work, including education, in the way it was historically structured, at least derived from how these were conceived in tradition. The discriminant there, fundamentally speaking, is whether the person is going to be able to do anything with that education. I'm finding, especially in the last years, an incredible sort of detachment, probably from the sense that education is not a matter of personal opinion. All right, there must be a room for individual growth within it, which entails of course the connection between, say, the master and the student, as much as sort of the balance between liberty and sort of command in many ways. But the notion that basically whatever you learn is valuable is not a problem of what you perform, but rather just the quantity of it, right? This is not the case, right? In order to be actually educated, you must have learned an incredibly large amount of stuff that I personally have not met, especially outside of my educational system abroad, even in the countries that are supposedly more advanced, and that was especially shocked by in terms of quantity, right? The notion that you can learn subjects in school at university just by a few, right? By some kind of brainstorming or kind of just say what you feel or think about this, has escalated to a degree by which essentially education has almost no value anymore. I don't want to open this thing because I think when I have to send my children to school, let's say that the question would be like, who is going to teach these kids? And I was relatively lucky because even though that there is always some kind of leftistic leaning in the field of education and schooling, etc., teachers were relatively sort of competent, and or at least they knew what they had to do, mixing an adequate level of sort of education with discipline, not leaving their sort of pushed liberalism to much interfere with the broader picture. There were also some flaws already, but it seems to me, generationally speaking, there is an absolute collapse. Thus, it's even more difficult. And the thing that shocked me the most is how younger generations' minds are basically set on that collapsingly low standard of nothingness that basically is also as directly proportional, similarly with, in fact, the skyrocketing of mental illnesses among the youth, and an increasing level of asociality, of psychosis, of utter ignorance, and absolutely low levels of formal education. So substance, I don't know, people who at this point criticize others for not citing sources directly, and or that, however, start filling their own videos with subcultural, video gaming or Netflix series kind of references, frankly, is the measure of that kind of mental disturbance, and it's a very serious social disease. So imagine in an age like, I don't know, the one after Black Death, how much, of course, the entire system had changed, and how education in this sense had also much worsened to some degree. 13th, early 14th century education was much more formally adequate. It was much more unitary and universal and European and Western in essence, when you look at it, of course, in Western Europe. And this was basically the only place where there was that level of shared but also qualitative level of actual moral and scientific standards that you do not find in other societies in the world at the time, where just an incredibly smaller amount of people proportionally had, and also a much more sclerotic and much less vibrant level of actual knowledge and education. In a way, of course, the great late medieval crisis does go towards this other end, because if anything, the elite and the oligarchies gain more power, but do so mostly in relative terms to the people, and they also had suffered of the crisis, so that they hadn't quite individually increased in relevance. And this paradox is to be seen in humanism, for example, where you actually have absolutely higher levels of competence in particular fields, like philology, for example, properly linguistics. There is also an historiography is being born. There are lots of things that actually that get better, right? If not necessarily in a formal sense, at least in a standardized one, right? There is the notion that, in fact, the more crisis there is, and the more you have to fix, not to forget, not to lose in the meanwhile, so that you can have other people remembering that, relying on that paper. It's like today, like relying on your hard disk. Before, you had to remember much more on your own. You had to write things down. You had much less means to store information, to browse it, etc. So while certain things improve, there are others that atrophies. And this is in part exactly what happens in this world. All right. Also, of course, this world requires something. Right, there is an expectation for the broader system. The problem is that this is often confused. First of all, again, elites gain more power, and there is paradoxically even a longer ranged level of interaction, because elites tower all the others and have more range in terms of properly wealth to spend to connect with the others. In fact, the Renaissance, like times like the ones of Erasmus, etc., were a product of this, except we're looking at it in that humanistic dimension. A few affluent, because essentially courtly maintained scholars managed to confront themselves with people much more far away in, if anything, more systematic fashion. It's not like Europeans hadn't been doing this since ever, as a matter of fact. But now they do so within the confines of some very specific fields, and again, in the videos about humanism, you will get a gist of what particularly we're particularly discussing. And we're looking also at incredibly high levels of education. It's not like this was, again, in certain ways, worse than it had been before. But less people learn this, and there is a greater focus, for example, mostly on this philological dimension, as opposed to, for example, political criticism that had been proper of a more direct civic participation in the previous centuries, for example, and more and more. And again, there is a reason if humanism is born in Italy, and in this sense you can't look at feudal societies in other part of the world having ever had much of a greater level of education. So it seems, for example, in perspective to the so-called modern age, there is, I don't believe it ever existed, that this sense of, look, we are firstly, for the first time, educating more people. Wow, what an achievement. In some parts of Europe, at the peaks of medieval civilization, people were very highly literate already in some specific contexts that those places weren't. And we tend to forget on which premise that rested and what had been developed, in fact, in those countries in a broader, say, universally comprehensive fashion, right? I know that some of you hate scholastics because it is considered as compared to the more spiritual, ascetic Neoplatonism that had been the most, at least, pursued current from antiquity, mostly because of the legacy of St. Augustine and all sort of the Neoplatonic studies that actually re-intensified at the end of the Middle Ages, mostly. But this sclerosis, due to almost modernistic, if not materialistic, it was something rationalistic, intended to reduce everything to mechanics, like the Aristotelian Thomistic system was proposing itself to do. This is an attitude, especially in the most radical, chic, wannabe, traditionalistic elite, whatever, as if, in tradition, action and contemplation weren't part of the same thing, and of course, any mean can be used to reach God in many ways. And of course, scholastics does suffer of certain ideas. It's very easy. Just the other day, I was reading St. Thomas' Summa Theologica, which immediately, however, makes you understand that behind this sort of more important, need for definitive. In fact, definition and fixation of particular standards, which was actually the entire point of the deal. There is, first of all, definitely not a naive approach. There is an enormous amount of knowledge. That the work is enormous. And for all what came with that, by the way, all the other works and how this became the pillar of further studies that had in turn based itself on other pillars of the previous centuries that were more or less along similar lines of more rational approach and comprehension, if anything, for teaching people, for educating people. But it is also incredibly clever, and it basically follows the same traditional vision of divinity. And of course, there are some questions that can be debated, of course, if anything, just like it's done methodologically in the work. But the end is just, this is a phase, right? A way to a universal comprehension. And it really helps because it makes also pretty fair points overall, and it widens your mind in ways that I personally don't know among, the philosophy students that I've ever met. So you can argue that happened because, of course, at the end of the great expansion of medieval civilization, there was already the germ of insecurity, of fear. And so these kind of ideas had to be fixed, right, in ways that we would probably be surprised by because we're a bit too conditioned by this literary and ex post sort of historiographical, philosophical studies that, let's say, that there was just a Platonic prevalence without a naturalistic, sort of rationalistic approach in the Middle Ages before the 13th century. This is really not true. What is really amazing and stands out is that medievals had a way, properly civilizationally, culturally, morally, to conceive a broader explanation for the entire universe that, in fact, went on for centuries as well, as the most sort of, as the foundation of most of knowledge and the presupposition of power as well in the following centuries, which also held and as a civilization, because the Middle Ages did not end, but it simply developed later. And as we were saying, it sort of waned in that now more sort of less optimistic, let's put it in this way, approach to tradition, that eventually the revolutions, so to say, and nationalism and or socialism and anti-traditional ideas of nation and society came to demonize, not just to disrupt, and sometimes also probably to cancel, to delete, but also because the individuals that came there were not comprehensively educated to understand what the system had been, and began to insinuate this ridiculous attitude there is today. Basically, what matters is your individual subjective standpoint, including as a human being, right? As if, the precondition of existence didn't lay at least beyond you as a mere individual, right? And this is unfortunately again an attitude that we have that has infested especially the philosophical branches of education, and especially I've seen in the Anglo-American world, as far as I'm concerned. So this does not mean, of course, that intellectual pursuits at the time lacked influence, nor that they weren't making good points. As we explained also in other videos, this is an interesting meeting point between, for example, a more educated and, in this sense, vocal, literate elite that starts explaining also war. We've seen it in different instances. There are lots of men-at-arms that, for example, by the 15th century start writing what war is to them, and also fairly accurate, and you can feel, yes, fatigue for the era compared to older standards attitudes, but not quite erroneous in the foundation. There is also substantial evidence indicating a rising societal need for skilled literates and university-educated individuals. So as we were saying before, actually literacy increased pretty much everywhere. All right, in absolute terms, probably also among the masses. This happened for different reasons. You can see this as instrumental and functional to mechanisms that were anti-universal. If you think that, monarchies increasingly developed a regionalistic sort of nationalistic character that was essentially clashing against the recomposition of a broader universal sense. And so they were ever more self-referential and so tailored on the specific needs of this or that ruler, that, as we've seen, had also much greater leverage on the literates that had been reduced to a very poor thing in terms of political influence compared to the past. They were much more controlled and very often, in fact, maintained at court. So people working also in government, in the administration, in law, etc. So people that were not chosen anymore much because of an incredible effervescence in individual, vision beyond in fact, those individual limits we were talking about before, rather just good at doing that specific function, just like a hyper-specialized one. This can be really seen through many examples, from humanism to even think about Machiavelli and his bureaucratic way of expression. That did not stifle much his mind, right? But at the same time, it was the expression to which he was habituated, and it partially influenced the same. For example, in fact, Machiavellian mostly the means justify the ends. The attitude towards a more always a universal aim, but one that has to pass in the meanwhile through the acceptation that certain things have to lack, let's say, a higher level of conscientiousness that would have been otherwise incredibly criticized in the past. There is also, alongside the established demand from regions with universities dating back to the 13th century, newly founded schools and universities in previously peripheral areas, contributing to growing educational needs. In the same way, think about, I don't know, where Luther grew as Wittenberg, but what were those centers? Some that would remain among the least developed in Europe compared to at least to the other bigger ones, right, of these princely powers. And in fact, harboring ideas that at some point were mostly used for exquisitely political opportunism and fostering in that very sense. We talked a bit about this in the videos about, for example, the development of power and, say, arms building in the Protestant world. I mean, the notion that, people like William the Silent were actually Catholics, but they essentially rode the wave of Protestantism in order to further autonomize their country, but for which aim, right? Merely a natural push to autonomism, or one that was looking at something more comprehensive. Evidently, the latter has not become, because we sort of lost ourselves along the centuries through the notion that, after all, there shouldn't be some sort of higher power or more collectively participated one. There are always tendencies of that kind, but at least we today forget things rather than giving some for granted, or maybe also, indeed, also the other way around. That is said to even 15th century thinkers were, in a sense, kind of obvious. I mean, think about the problem of Reformation. In the 15th century, there had been some prodromes to that, but the collective awareness across Europe that those ideas were fundamentally heretical because they undermined the proper purpose of a universal power for the sake of salvation, for the sake of grace and the imperium, etc., were obviously just, intolerant of any other idea. And it sort of makes sense. What's actually better? That we have all different ideas for which purpose? You mature that sense because you have an idea that, unfortunately, as fallen kind, we do not agree as we should. And however, we've seen that usually who rises trying to impose this kind of ideas does not necessarily get them right. Of course, because in theory, like the more advanced a place is, and the more quality the individuals have, all right? And so they should, at that point, unite in a politically cohesive way, which is a fundamental traditional concept, towards a single direction, right? So the idea has instead substituted itself of essentially having all different ideas, because that sole purpose of being united towards a single purpose, it may be even dangerous or fascistic or whatever, all right? There is a difference in quality. There are totalitarian regimes in which people mostly are trained to reason in the same way, but they have also an incredibly low level of education. They're essentially stupid, underdeveloped, paranoid, mental illnesses, and that's the measure why they may push for a same purpose, but with an incredibly weak force that, in fact, renders these regimes incredibly fragile. Whereas the West, in all its, for example, sort of struggle within itself, which is actually a good symptom of a functional civilization, can have excesses that undermine the entire system, and the decline of mankind definitely does continue through this, but at least it sustained itself on a functional mechanism where you have still up to this generation, as we've just seen, a wide amount of people were pretty highly educated and that fundamentally control the system, because they are the only ones that at the end of the day know how to make it work, right? So also the notion that, everything depends on heads of government. How, where, why, right? It's not really how power works, and it's unsurprising that the lesser a person one is, and the more they think that there is such a thing like a single individual, at least in this kind of world, that rules everything, and it truly has this immense power, even though is a guy maybe remains in power for 4 years and then goes away, or this kind of things. In any case, the same problems by different degrees existed today, we do have today in a much greater fashion, at least because of the collapse of individual quality and obvious realization of why basic civilizational foundations should align with a particular behavior and a particular obedience and a particular level, if anything, also of liberty, autonomy, awareness, and all this stuff. If anything, we discussed this in videos, especially about the history of law. But we will see now how this were applying to the 15th century, where, for example, the importance of representative assemblies actually grew. And not much because individual liberty increased, actually quite the opposite, right? Because these parliaments were often the expression of estates that were ever more separated from the rest of society, right? It is also a kind of an actual view, right, and perspective on power. Now, before anyone says anything, remember that also the coercive power of a monarchy, and the reason why, for example, these parliaments had power was ridiculous compared to today's, for example, states. So the actual level of participation today in, if anything, just the potential of influencing the system is potentially much higher than before. At the time, paradoxically, you could do more at a local level, but naturally it was more difficult, especially in this later phase of the Middle Ages, to do anything about the wall. And traditionally, the latter also happened mostly if it was an opportunity, not much in more advanced countries, but actually in pretty messed up ones that lacked much of a center and functional development. So we should definitely not give civilization for granted in many ways. The church remained, as we were saying before, a major employer of educated individuals, to say the least. Traditional monasticism stood apart, also because monasteries had gone under a profound crisis, starting especially from the 14th century. Mendicant orders consistently provided a strong intellectual foundation for many of their members through a dual system of internal studia and university ones, which expanded with the creation of new theology faculties. Essentially, the mendicant orders successfully took over university education. In most fields, this occurred thanks to the fact that, as you know, they were essentially established mostly in cities. I made lots of videos about the mendicant orders, that especially by this point, you don't have to imagine again as that sort of borderline heretical rabble that the Church of Rome successfully integrated by disciplining, in fact, and educating in the early days in the 13th century. But something, again, now controlling an incredibly structurally orthodox system of education, peaking in basically every faculty, also scientifically speaking, and more. And the fortune of these orders, differently from traditional monasticism, that had remained, in this sense, a bit cut off from especially the cities as the true center of power, was in fact due to the foundation of university studia that were obviously urban-based, right? And initially the mendicants had this issue because they should have educated themselves by themselves, but the problem is that since they had spread pretty early on, as you know, the time of St. Francis and St. Dominic, all over Europe, without sometimes having even seen or met the same founders, right? That tells you the speed of how much they had developed. They needed a pretty tight form of regulation and education, and since they couldn't simply create, as also normally poor, undereducated people, higher levels of power and education, they were subsidized in part by the church, in part by, again, the mechanism, the alms, this incredibly successful support they offered but also received from urban centers to, in fact, study very often abroad, by the way, in the greatest theological universities of Europe. And there were also many scandals. Think about the especially in the Franciscan fringe, the epuration was carried out of the Sorbonne, the stabilization of the affair, the generalship of the Bonaventure, and so on. I made videos about that, the contested legacy of Francis in that regard. But you understand, by the way, another aspect that I find quite fascinating, that is that the great age of heresies, at least in the way they had been historically known in the 12th century had died, right? Also, the Protestantism would have a quite different character from that. And you can say that in the 13th century, by the 14th, the main heresies in Europe had been successfully crushed because, in fact, the most important centers of power drew definitely the highest educational and theological standards from the same, also mendicant studies. And again, this had started also in some cases, like Franciscans were the least educated originally. St. Dominic instead had created this incredibly rigid standards of anti-heretical rhetoric, dialectic, logic, and so on that had in fact successfully defeated the Cathars in the main public, seas of discussion, right, in the cities as well. It's a very interesting story, and if anything, we have to make more videos about how mendicant orders came from sort of passed from the underdogs to the masters of the situation. After completing foundational studies in arts and philosophy, mendicants focused primarily on theology, which ensured, in that sense, the stability of the imperial Catholic system. In numerous regions, especially in Mediterranean Europe, they held a near monopoly over this field, equipping them for roles such as preachers or inquisitors. The reason why this happened is not just that it had support from the papacy, but again, Mediterranean Europe was historically more urbanized, more literate, right? And so, and had also more universities. The older ones, the more important. So, in this sense, you realize why also certain Catholic education, the one that would be also contested as the only authority in Europe at the time by Protestantism, etc., laid also in a different cultural pool than just a more homogeneous one, equally scattered across the continent, provided that the general standards were, however, shared by everybody. I mean, it's not like Catholicism at some point died, even in the areas where Protestants took over, right? It was always, for centuries, a deep awareness of the validity of the original Catholic understanding, also international in terms of powers, institutions, and so on. The empire, that is something that you can see, of course, in all its limitations, right? But we're talking the Middle Ages, where those limitations had historically remained out, right? Compared from the unitary, universal Roman Empire of antiquity. Of course, medieval Europe had, as we've seen, struggled to keep up with the same heavenly standards and ecumenic unity. And so unity breaking, splitting, contesting authority can be seen, of course, as a failure of the latter when succeeding, but also an active sin and a lost opportunity, and mostly a sort of smearing self-sabotage for the sake of just the here and now, as opposed to a more long-term purpose. Among the secular clergy, however, those trained in canon law greatly outnumber theologians. Many clerics held only a master's degree in arts. All right, so there had been an active certification. There was also functionalization properly of this education for administrative, governmental purposes and beyond. Nonetheless, the proportion of graduates among the secular clergy reached unprecedented heights in many regions during the 15th century, which means that the episcopal estate was ever more educated. Right, and for example, in England between 1399 and 1485, 72 of 79 identified bishops had university training, with one having studied at an inn of court even. So we're looking at, as we were saying before, an ever more oligarchic form of education, but at least in as much as this establishment had taken on its back all the burden of the late medieval crisis, at least they had pretty solid shoulders, right? And they were pretty highly educated. And this was an incredible pattern, especially if you consider what we said before, that university education was ever more Europeanly intertwined and had properly hired at some levels that were very well identifiable at those levels of education. Of course, differences existed across Europe in teachings and in this background and so on. But in general, there was a broader awareness that now that's what essentially bishops were. That's the kind of education that they received, and that's the kind of capacities that they normally had. Remember what I just said about the necessity of maintaining a unitary empire. This was all aiming at that sort of uniformly functional level of government, right? We tend to see this mostly in national terms because, of course, there had always been local interests, and the same bishops, of course, were truly secular in power in as much as they had forces under their control. They were ever closer to the crown. There was a specific hierarchy within the church as well. There were landlords, especially in certain areas of Europe. There were entire ecclesiastical principalities. And so, in as much as those, again, differences existing forcefully in a fallen world, they were all different. But in relative terms to those times society, there were also a pretty substantial body of actually successfully holding power holders, let's say, that were functional to the broader system. And if you look at kingdoms, the empire, and how the entire system operated historically, everything was according to the Roman administrative pattern based on the local diocese and the various hierarchy of bishops. The papacy was properly like the vertex of this, and there was a shared background in that sense. There was a proper sense of belonging to that unitary universal tradition, and the local bishops were very much involved in backing, usually in fact, monarchic power, and pursuing also national agendas in that regard, as they were loyal to the crown at the point, even more than towards the Pope. But what strikes you is how at the end of the Middle Ages, the system was, although increasingly sort of difficult to maintain in that uniform fashion because of the heavy blow of the late medieval crisis, still standing, right? And eventually influencing the following developments, even when Christianity was deeply fractured. A similar pattern emerged among canons, by the way. For example, in York during the 15th century, 4 out of 5 of the minister's resident canons were graduates. There was a very high level of education, even in the lower echelons of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In northern France, comparable trends appeared. The proportion of graduates among canons in Laon, which stood at 43% between 1270 and 1378, doubled to 86% by 1409, although nearly half held only a master's degree in arts, which, again, it was already something. It's just like you say today, a master's degree in proportion, really. And so a doctorate was something else, but in general, there were also people of that higher caliber. We should stress, by the way, that this education, here we're talking mostly the church, because obviously it's priority, but there was an incredibly advanced level of lay education and of doctorate. It was and doctoral quality was equated to nobility, properly by juridical status in those societies. Not as if they were literally noblemen in virtue of your education. We often think about this, especially for France, as far as the noblesse de robe as opposed to the noblesse de paix. But if you look, for example, at communal Italy, the early the early jurists, right, the commentarists, people like Bartolus, etc., were considered like veritable heroes and people that were really needed to run states, and whose juridical expertise was incredibly precious on the market and informing, in fact, vast amount. We've seen how Roman law spread all over Western Europe from Italy in by the Renaissance, basically. And so think about this. as we were saying at the beginning as well, Europe is different. This development in educational level was slower in some areas, obviously enough mostly in Central, Northeastern Europe, but was noticeable everywhere at that point. For instance, in the Danish chapter of Roskilde, the share of former students increased from just a bit over a half between 1367 and 1430 to almost 4/5 between 1431 and 1493, which is a very solid sort of 25% gained in the span of basically not even a century and a half. While the proportion of graduates, particularly in arts, rose from 1 out of 5 to almost 1 out of 2. Naturally, Denmark was not, such a underdeveloped country in general, but let's say it was also not one of the most performing in absolute terms. Now, by the century's close, the abundance of graduates in many regions meant that some could not secure a canonry and had to settle for parish roles. Hence, by the way, the same term clerk that refers to a layman, but it's mostly tailored over, a feudal society like England, where most educated people were clergy, basically. And there were other areas of Europe in which this was not the case from half of a millennium almost. So think about how that affects also an entire worldview, and even how we explained this in the video about medievalistics. The type of cultural output, like who were people who wrote histories, right? This is a topic to which I'm incredibly sensitive because even though I haven't had ever this enormous interest in historiography per se, it's incredibly concrete to see properly the difference in background and how this would influence mindset. It's not to say, by the way, that medieval mindset was, particularly limited, but as we explained before, by the 15th century, that kind of level of moral and scientific eruption of the great medieval civilization had suffered a significant blow. Now, generally, lay graduates did not serve on princely councils, which were reserved for the higher nobility. However, from the early 15th century, chancelleries and sovereign courts of justice, so all these organisms that would gradually develop out of sort of more primitive councils, such as the King's Bench or the Parliament of Paris, just to stick to England and France, were increasingly dominated by lay graduates. And this is also kind of obvious. France, in particular, had been pioneering the development of a third estate as far as the it could not quite compare with the lay forces, and so the destiny of the church was sort of to side with the with lay government and to become increasingly dependent on that. While ecclesiastical careers remained the primary path for young men educated at schools or universities, the lay sector's demand for graduates, as we were just observing, had surged dramatically in the 15th century. It is worth noting, however, that many secular positions during this period could still be filled by clerics. Right? This is particularly the case in northwestern Europe, and not only, mostly in the feudal world. This is particularly true for the minor orders, as observed, for example, by some studies in England. Hence, by the way, the same term clerk that refers to a layman, but it's mostly tailored over a feudal society like England, where most educated people were clergy, basically, and there were other areas of Europe in which this was not the case from half of a millennium almost. So think about how that affects also an entire worldview, and even how we explained this in the video about medievalistics. The type of cultural output, like who were people who wrote histories, right? This is a topic to which I'm incredibly sensitive because even though I haven't had ever this enormous interest in historiography per se, it's incredibly concrete to see properly the difference in background and how this would influence mindset. It's not to say, by the way, that medieval mindset was, particularly limited, but as we explained before, by the 15th century, that kind of level of moral and scientific eruption of the great medieval civilization had suffered a significant blow. Now, generally, lay graduates did not serve on princely councils, which were reserved for the higher nobility. However, from the early 15th century, chancelleries and sovereign courts of justice, and so all these organisms that would gradually develop out of sort of more primitive councils, such as the King's Bench or the Parliament of Paris, just to stick to England and France, were increasingly dominated by lay graduates. And this is also kind of obvious. France, in particular, had been pioneering the development of a third estate royal administration since the 13th century. Also because it was sort of much bigger country that had very different levels of sort of hierarchical development, again, of territorial control issues and so on. So we'll talk more about that. If anything, there is a specific playlist called Medieval Government that analyzes exactly this kind of differences in sort of administrative development, the birth of also of a bureaucracy, right? Many modernists really are trained to think that bureaucracy, like, permanent troops or whatever, it only were created for the first time in the modern age, or at least the standard, the degree by which you can call something like this is just what they decide, obviously tailoring it on the modern age, which did not even exist historically wise. But if we're really talking about comparable sort of systems of bureaucratic systems, like the French papal Angevin axis had been the major leader since the 13th century, and it was the place where, as we've seen also, the greatest theological and legal and scientific studies had fundamentally developed from. There was always, of course, there is a limit by which, say, laymen could, or simple third estaters could simply enter important positions in the administration. However, it really depends where and when we're talking about. The number of graduates, in any case, grew rapidly. At the Council of Brabant, I made a video about medieval Brabant if you're interested, the Duchy's highest court, the proportion of graduates rose from 40 to 70% over the century. And naturally, places like Brabant were influenced by a sort of third estate background as well, because these Flemish centers were very much historically bourgeois, developed. There was a feudal dimension, but this had sort of blended, and especially at this point under the Burgundians, they wanted to strip the local nobility from important power were conferring for local government, in particular administration. They were conferring ever more functions to the local Flemish councils, right? Even more plentiful were roles within the local administrative systems of princely governments, which sustained a network of attorneys and lawyers. This, in some areas of Europe, had really been enormous, and because they were required for sustaining the civic, political, and economical development. It's been studied that in the Nievole Valley in Tuscany, 1/3 of the local population was a notary, or being part of a family of notaries, right? And this is insane. I mean, obviously, that's sort of a peak reality. I don't know whether other places in Tuscany were, or in Lombardy were like that, but you also understand why. Now, low graduates could secure comfortable positions in the systems, as we said before. They could even achieve nobility, publicly recognized by, and also internationally recognized, because we should point out that these institutions were not, like today, sort of self-referential, setting their own standards. To a degree, yes. But the notion that the subject preceded the institution, and that, of course, this derived from a divine standard to attain, and that was also incarnated by authority in this world, which remained also in those countries that sort of contested the higher authorities, while, for example, strengthening their own at a lower level, was really pan-European, and or properly considered in a universal sense within Christendom, Western Christendom in any case. There were significant sort of comparisons at the time already, meeting ground with other cultures. If you think about, I don't know, the Byzantine influence at this time in history, it would end up to be just sort of superficial, but aside from the strictly philological world, there was an awareness, of course, of the fact that this Western tradition had an identity on its own, right? And it was something stemming also from the previous centuries. It hadn't been born in the 15th. It had, again, boomed in the 12th, the 13th centuries, from depending on where you look at universities, from the 11th, right? Now, by the 15th century's end, however, the sheer number of graduates, such as in the Bailliage near Paris, meant that some doctors or licentiates had to accept lower-level positions early in their careers, as we've just seen for the theologians, roles that previous generations had filled with non-university educated individuals as well. And so this is exactly like it happened today. Today, everybody wants to be a PhD, right? And our professors, at a point, became professors even in the age in which there wasn't even a PhD to make, right? They passed directly from the master to basically under the wings of the, of the cathedra, so to say. And so it's an incredibly relatable scenario that also opens to to a moment of great crisis: the Italian wars, the Ottoman invasions. This is not a coincidence, right? There is also that point in history, a sort of exhaustion that proceeds at different levels, sedimenting different ideas and worldviews. The aforementioned passage from sort of a more traditional view to already a sort of more modern one during the Renaissance is a very important passage. A growing number of towns, along with semi-independent city-states in the Italian peninsula and Germany, as well as the bonnes villes of France, integrated into the monarchies, in fact, of France, England, and Spain, began relying on university-trained doctors and jurists. All right. Because also the level, consider that we're a bit in the age of polymaths. So while it is true that there were ever more specialized channels of education, education could be really one from different backgrounds. I recently made a video about Guicciardini that was born exactly in this period, and we've seen that he was basically a government official, essentially almost the most powerful person in Tuscany at a certain point during the Italian wars, governmentally wise, administrative wise. But he had began as a merchant, then had naturally specialized in other offices and so on. There was a more open kind of recognition of who was fit for which roles. And say if you were, a particularly educated person in a field, well, there were chances that you were also in others. And this is something we have seen in many different circumstances, also in that video about the birth of humanism. We're talking about Giovanni da Cermenate, for example. He was a notary and a mayor, and again, he was officially involved, but he was also a great historian because he liked history and wrote about history. And that's sort of many circumstances. Think about Petrarch, right? He studied law, then abandoned that, then he dedicated himself to letters, but he was also an ambassador. This is naturally, obviously, more typical of societies where standards were not so strict like you would have today, where more or less we tend to sort of compress the level of education, mostly by saying, okay, there is so much to know that in practice, if you follow one path, like good luck finding your form in all this substance. In any case, at the time, of course, being educated was somehow exceptional, especially, for covering these higher governmental roles. In certain places, such as Barcelona, Montpellier, and Nuremberg, skepticism from the merchant elite limited these professionals to primarily vocational roles. In other words, whenever a commercial establishment was involved, the merchants, essentially the bankers, ruled. They didn't want people with other forms of education, right, coming by, right. Elsewhere, in fact, professionals gain access to managing the communal affairs, all right. So this is very interesting because it's like a mob, right. If the merchants rule, like who are other governmental affairs? And this is quite fascinating because these centers, by the way, like Barcelona, Montpellier, Nuremberg, etc., were in fact quite important commercial centers. Not only Montpellier was a seat, for example, a very important university already at the time, but the use of other forms of say professionals for covering governmental roles, in fact, was typical of societies that were ruled by the first estate rather than the third one that was already inclined to sabotage a little. In fact, searching mostly for that logic of profit and autonomy that would undermine a great part. Think about the merchants, the marchands de l'eau, and their role during the 100 Years' War in Paris. They were at the center of the greatest monarchy out there. They felt, however, in fact, the burden of that over their shoulders, and they tried to sabotage and calling the English the Burgundians. So that's at the expense, literally, of the entire kingdom. They would have preferred that to basically be aborted so that they would have won this sort of florid, decentralized position, increasing their profits. So that is, frankly, very, very destructive. It's just the profit as a material end to itself, as opposed to profit as, okay, with that material I will build something more unitary, right? But of course, every polity tends to do that, one way or another. But when there is another system where that you can reform other than basically tearing down, together with all the millennia of efforts to really develop it, and out of which you were born yourself, well, you are committing a great sin in general. You're basically destroying, not building, right? So this advancement of various professionals to administrative offices brought significant social shifts as well, especially in a world where really these roles were a bit crystallizing, right? What was achieved here largely would bring these individuals to detach themselves as estates on their own compared to the larger amount of the population. Merchants began sending their sons to universities and arranging marriages for their daughters with graduates. This was very typical as well, and it is true also at very higher levels. Like there are, think about the Medicis as a house of bankers. They were not just bankers that had been born as nobility itself, but they mostly emerging as that kind of commercial and republican patriciate, marrying to the most radically monarchic power of Europe and the French and the Valois houses. And of course, both sides being very glad of getting the best of both, like the nobility, the higher feudal status, and sort of the wealth, right, the money. That's always a great... This happens many times in history and society. Also, 18th century England witnessed a lot of that historically. In any case, opportunities in private practice also emerged for those with degrees in law or medicine especially. and you know what kind of authority a lawyer or a doctor really were, even just up to a few generations ago in the West, were probably considered better people. Something that unfortunately today is not quite the case, but in the very sense, not that unfortunately also them are not often better people than the others, at least on average they are, but also given the flattening of mass standards, those standards have also collapsed. Now, individuals with only a master's degree in arts, if they did not remain in the clergy, could at least become schoolmasters, was an opportunity. It's also notable that studying for its own sake or without immediate career prospects was not uncommon either in the 15th century and may have seen a resurgence, exactly because the elite became ever more powerful and therefore they sort of, a bit like today, like young people are not unemployed, even though some of them are very highly educated. In part it's because they don't find a job, but the truth is that the job is there, just they don't want to work. They say, okay, I'm overqualified and I'm not really, I have money, I'm going to eat. Even if I don't work in a moment, I'm just going to improve until I be top within a specific context. And it's a very romantic way of going, but it does eventually translate itself in actual job opportunities, and of the better kind. A growing desire for literacy, fueled by the spread of popular books through printing in the century's latter half, in particular, drove urban populations, including artisans and nobles, to send more young people to schools. All right, this, we've seen, was incentivized by the church as well. There was for example, a great deal of customization of devotional practice. The church was an incredible instrument of literacy spread at this point. Before we talk about the Inquisition, there was all a societal support to this, right? There was an idea that the better you knew what your religion was and the least risks you would... you see, we said it before, 14th, 15th century society was not completely free of heresy. But in at least countries like, I don't know, Italy, France, let's leave aside, I don't know, the Lollards, the Hussites, etc. There was always a fourth estate that would try to rebel and had these more difficult ideas, but they were put under, right? They were successfully contained. And actually, the church at this point, you would think, again, according to the Black Legion, okay, so the church prefers everybody to remain ignorant and illiterate. Absolutely not. They were actually spreading. They were also succeeding in maintaining heresies down by spreading literacy among the masses, which you would say, but doesn't this increase the risks of heresy, actually? Because that's also how it had happened basically by the 12th century. More people were literate. There were more third estaters involved in government and things. Well, the difference is that it was a rising system without regulations at the top yet, right? Here's the difference. It's a stagnating system that is enrocked on ever more oligarch posts. And so even if you spread literacy, for example, among these people, it's not like these people are going to take over in particular, numerically, nor there is properly much of a need, but to preserve at this point, given the terrible sort of things that were happening at the time, and the also actual lack of real political opportunities, for example, to exploit kind of heretical movements that in any case were put down also throughout this other sort of fringe contexts. Paradoxically, during the Reformation, heresy would spread thanks to the fact that it was the elite, the government, that backed certain fringe ideas that would help their autonomization compared to universal authorities, and for pursuing, again, quite concretely also menial achievements in terms of monarchic power concentration. Also in times where, again, there were still nobiliary revolts. This, as you know, would essentially infect itself in confessional struggles within the same countries, pretty much all over Europe, except Italy, for example, where there were no confessional wars. And you can say, but the Pope there prohibited books to be published or whatever. Well, but you know, it's not like it was a bad place to live in at the time. So this is interesting because I tell you, I'm about to start to create the first video from the branch of the cycle dedicated to modern or contemporary history, by the way. But we're going, obviously, to cover much of this as well, like from other videos. I see with great satisfaction, by the way, that my video about here for a few minutes about my master thesis series about the Battle of Markfeld has been released into the world according to program, and that you are now about to be shocked by the news about it. Additional factors included new demands from the laity, spurred by religious reform movements such as, for example, the desire to read the Bible, which in fact was not just a matter, as we explained, of just mere reform, right? The notion here that the church was controlling the biblical reading gatherings, for example, historically. This had, by the way, if you read this being issued by a pope in the 13th century, it's not like they had the capacity to really knock at your door, even just through properly the lay and ecclesiastical net of subordinates that would rule in the society. First of all, it worked because society worked according to the obvious necessities of this. I mean, the Bible is properly the sacred text for Christianity, and in that sense, you cannot simply assume, especially in the age of heresy, that everybody can read it publicly, saying whatever they want about that. Right? It's as if, I don't know, I started teaching math by claiming that 2 + 2 makes 5, right? And spreading to people. And obviously, again, we don't here make this parallelism to especially stimulate the mind of those the most sort of the most modern mind, the most secular mind. As of course we have decided for some reason, at least at a conventional level, that religion cannot pair with sort of other moral and scientific levels and so on. But say nobody today would think that teaching bad math or wrong math is fundamentally admissible, right? And obviously a person doing so would probably also face some legal consequences. It's the same identical thing if you are looking at how literally the universe is to be interpreted. The only difference is that at the time, there was a shared consensus on how that was, and it was not held by, just the church or even the empire, because simply the coercive means were not there. Today, we think that there should not be any coercion in that sense whatsoever, even though there is. And our curricula are often modernized, secularized, and even teaching things like we all know are the most actually immoral and anti-scientific ideologies that have emerged in the last decade or so, that fortunately have caused also a tide of resistance to that. Does not necessarily come from people that have very clear ideas about even what tradition is, but it's obviously unsustainable because it is evil in many ways. So the church in the 15th century, we just explained, it was mostly regulating the ways in which the Bible could be mostly publicly taught, but in terms of private devotion, in terms of individual literacy, actually was promoting an enormous increase in reading of the Bible. In fact, the adage that, again, it's just the Reformation that allowed the Bible to be read. No, that's basically the Reformation that was allowing the Bible to be read in particular ways without the otherwise previous limits on that, not the being prevented from reading the Bible, becoming literate or whatever. This is nonsensical, and especially the Protestant countries at the time were actually more illiterate than the Catholic ones. And so the thing should make you really think about that. There were, again, other avenues before we remember, of course, the Italian humanism at this point was setting properly the literary, philosophical, philological, and linguistic, historiographical, and they were all blended standards out there. I always remind you that, for example, the donation of Constantine was debunked by a papal humanist that simply also published that and with the agreement of the church, so that the entire myth of these guys were trying to prevent others from knowing things, this kind of paranoid lesser people's superstition, is typical, if anything, of a post-imperial traditional Catholic mentality, if anything. And there were, if anything, always so many reasons for which being educated and pursuing, in that sense, a specific profession was valued for either cultural or even fashionable reasons of sort. As we've seen, there had been at some point even an over education, whereby at that point you wouldn't even, you would, just like today, take a title, whatever, mostly just in order to fit in, because who doesn't go to university, right? And as a consequence, most of those degrees are worthless, not because the curricula are not good, it's because people are not good, right? And they ruin the average and spread a bad reputation also about education itself. And so more people say, stop believing in education, whereas education is always there. It's not a strange way of life. It's literally what you learn that matters, not your personal opinion or feeling about that. While traditional university faculties were somewhat slow to meet, of course, all of these expectations were actually pretty rigid. And it is true that these institutions were based on authority, were quite sort of also intersecting with private, as we've seen, oligarchic power and so on. Newer institutions, or at least at some lower levels, such as the schools of the Brethren of the Common Life or the Humanist Contubernia, there were some kind of elite meeting in the case among, pretty solid intellectuals, all private, again, so all free in a way, proved more effective for the purpose, contributing, in fact, to their success. Admittedly, as we just explained, these were, however, secondary institutions of sort. They could be very influential, even from a political point of view, or a few ways to approach spirituality. Europe was not new to important changes. Before we observed how the mendicant education changed, really, worldview in many ways. If you're interested in that, probably the urban space of this new education, there's a video about Humberto of Romain that was also connected with the recent video that I made about Frederick II siege of Rome, just for telling you how actually close to some of the major events of the millennium these individuals were, these thinkers were. The emergence of the Peregrinatio Academica is also fascinating. This was essentially a precursor to the later Grand Tour, witnessing young noblemen from England, Germany, and Scandinavia traveling to the Italian peninsula for brief visits to major studia, reflecting these cultural interests. This is kind of obvious because, as we just pointed out, by the way, England, Germany, and Scandinavia would be essentially places where the Reformation spread. And so they were evidently also the places that were more in need, at least when a Catholic elite ruled those countries, of probably this spring of culture, of education, of humanism, of broader cultural standards of the time in the great, in fact, universities of central northern Italy. This is incredibly relevant, of course, in a European sense, because it shows you that these very countries that eventually would sort of break away and despise Rome, Italy, so even in a greater, we're talking during the Reformation, right, had instead a Catholic soul that they had been cultivating. Admittedly, some of these people maybe later in their life became Protestants themselves. You can't quite equate the notion, okay, well, they went to Rome and so they decided to become Protestant. That's not how it happened, really. Also because here we're also looking at, it's not just, Germany was half Catholic, half Protestant at some point, but for saying how actually exactly these more remote places and this, in part, less developed ones, that, however, had enough surplus to send people. But this is much rarer for Slavs, for example. Even though that happened as well, could and would gladly send their children to be educated there. By the way, this was not new at all. We've seen it in the videos about the earlier centuries universities. There were properly fraternities of different nationalities. And again, we've seen it in the best documented cases of Bologna, of Padua. There were historically Germans. Well, that was always been there. There were Frenchmen, there were Englishmen. So that had always been the case. You can argue that it's the same still today, also with the various Erasmus, with the idea that at least Europeans are ever more sort of interconnected with one another. However, reflect on the times and places, what it meant in the 15th century, even just to travel from. It was not so dramatic as you may have been terrorized about, but it still carried naturally a great burden. Some of these families would indebt themselves to allow their youth to be educated, and maybe actually losing everything because these guys became dissolute and squandered everything in brothels and in drinking and whatever. Often, this is very well witnessed. There were pretty ferocious brawls among university students, and this is quite fascinating, especially between the various national confraternities. But it is still a European scale thing, right? It's not merely a provincial, localistic thing. No, we're talking here, especially also in the 15th century, ever more elite people, admittedly, as we leitmotif this throughout the entire video. Despite a widespread demographic decline until at least the mid-15th century, significant increase in the number of people receiving education during the 15th century, both relatively and absolutely, is readily understandable, even amidst the misfortunes of the period. While some long-standing university centers such as Paris, Montpellier, and Toulouse may have stagnated, also because of, in fact, the 100 Years' War, also the fact that when the French monarchy sort of took over everything again, it sort of diminished the autonomy of some of these centers, especially in the south, even though not quite actually sometimes the more far away cities were provided with more autonomy, but in that sense at the expense of the local estates from the side of the elite, so rendering this centers of study not even so thriving as they had historically been at the peak of the great medieval civilization. Progress was clear elsewhere, right? Even Paris declines in a way because, of course, it becomes the center more of a national monarchy as opposed to the greatest center of universal Catholic studies. Right? This is naturally, again, it's debatable. Paris, the Sorbonne remain throughout all its history a great center of study, including Montpellier and so on, but not quite as they had been important in the previous centuries. The combined student population at Oxford and Cambridge grew from around 2,000 to 3,000 between 14 and 1500. In Germany, the growth was particularly striking. By 1480, approximately 2,500 new German students enrolled annually, 5 times the number from a century earlier, right? Which, indeed, comparatively, shows you how, of course, Germany was a huge country by this time, even just properly superficial, but also in number of the population, by the way, had a relatively low amount of educate. This is quite interesting. We talked a bit about 14th, 15th century Germany. I really want to make much more thorough, in-depth videos about 14th, 15th century Germany, and I am gathering all the evidence, all the sources for this. Stats alone do not tell the full story. The development that we just showed, of course, indicate a raise in, again, the level of in some cases, probably the quantity, the level of education, but mostly the quantity of the educated. This, as we've seen, has to be calibrated, if anything, also to demographic growth and regrowth, by the way, in some instances. So as we just explained, contextually to the society, despite these numbers, only a small segment of the population was involved. These were powerful people, right? The science, rich men that really were pursuing normally like the best options that their status allowed them to, and as the leaders of that society, as the heads of future families, the great patriarchs. And of course, this is fully within the imperial Catholic traditional model. Notably, while education was becoming more valued, many professions remained outside the academic system due to either disdain or ignorance, even though it should always be understood how, right? Relying instead on vocational apprenticeships or family networks. There is normally an anti-Middle Ages kind of, they hated science, they were ignorant, they didn't know. You have to understand, of course, how, not just in the times, certain things were unknown, but why, right? If the society worked the way the medieval one did, it's not like you projecting in that world would have changed who knows what. Because even if you had to introduce the different ideas, techniques, or whatever, you would have probably lacked the resources to immediately develop an induct that could make any consistent, how do you plan, an industrial production in a world like that. It's impossible. It doesn't make any sense, right? They were working much better with what they had than you would ever make them work like. So don't think that you're the smart, developed, more intelligent, capable. You're an incredibly weak, dumb, ignorant, and incapable individual compared to a medieval one. There was, again, all a level of apprenticeship that very often we also don't see, because it was properly ruled by the masters over, and it also was essentially a craft, a business that the various guilds maintained a bit of secrecy on. It was also completely normal and sensible. This included training for artists, architects, early civil engineers in fields like mining and metallurgy. I'm preparing some content on that in more sort of archaic terms, but 15th century witnesses the introduction of hydraulic insufflation, which changes a big deal, things to say. But otherwise, the material world had, while improving in some ways, of course, remained very similar to the ones of previous centuries. And it would still for a long time, still, by the way. Military engineering. This is the century of the trace italienne that we talked about in other videos. Specializing in artillery and fortifications, made lots of videos about medieval siege warfare and how it sort of changed over time. Lots of videos also about artillery. And also those engaged in trade and shipping, which, as you know, was paving the way to this so-called age of exploration, etc. Even professions more closely tied to academic disciplines were not well served by universities, as a matter of fact. At least this was true in higher sort of spheres that today we consider them better than nucleated fashion, but even consider for the time what kind of purpose they had, really. This often limited the role of jurisdictional oversight, but were also more specialized crafts that were quite useful and that often performed different services than the ones that the same, say, the professions with the same name today actually do. And they were also subordinated, of course, in a world in which that's mostly the most they could make of it, rather than being, I don't know, as some modernist books suggest, like being oppressed by the authority of the universities that didn't know, and then as practitioners knew better, right? This is also what especially a certain Protestant ideology believed later, and also in trying to, again, undermine the concept of, again, this old traditional Catholic establishment, the Aristotelic Thomistic thing. I mean, what was actually practically worked, like in the time of Galileo, to actually determine that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the other way around? I mean, it's not like it's not important or it's not of immense consequence in different moral and scientific sense. But at the time, considering what was happening in Europe, there were overwhelmingly more important things. It's like Musk saying, okay, now we should go on Mars. You can imagine how inspirational that would be, but can't you do something more important for like specific issues here, like shooting a missile to a rock, right? It doesn't seem as important as developing new forms of political, military, or social organization, and achievements of regular. I'm just saying, and this is the eternal, in fact, sort of technologistic delusion that often strikes. Barbers, surgeons, notaries, and scribes, soon to be replaced, the latter by printers, continued to be trained through apprenticeships. And this was kind of obvious because it was also their craft, frankly. How much do you hear people rightly complaining today saying that crafts do not quite exist anymore, right? Everything is automatized, or people do not want to become this kind of practitioners of some sort because, I don't know, they all want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. On another level, particularly in the Italian peninsula, new learned associations known as academies emerge in some bourgeois and noble circles, allowing individuals to bypass traditional university education, which should make you think really when, again, we think that this was mostly the center of the aforementioned traditional Catholic establishment. There were ways next to that, and not even in opposition to that. For example, Protestantism spread minimally, right? There was never actually solid, aside from the Valdensians in the Northwest, like, Italian Protestantism, other than a bunch of very elite sort of and very rare thinkers in that regard. Second, the social and cultural implications of the expanded educated population merit consideration as well. While some contemporary writings lamented an overproduction of graduates, just like today, a theme that would persist, in fact, it is inaccurate to suggest that the growth in educated individuals had reached a crisis of some sort. At least, individuals may have difficulties in finding, as we've seen, the preferred kind of craft, but it's just like today. The fact that there is a saturation of the market does not mean that that this saturation depends on literally everybody who has a degree in that is an expert and so deserves to earn who knows what amount. There is a system that works by demand and offer, and say if you are really good and useful and you can, in any field, of course, invent and create and experiment and teach something new that is going to be of positive effect, you're going to succeed, right? So the crisis is more the one of a broader system rather than of education per se. And there's never really been a crisis of education. There is, if anything, a mentality that pushes the idea, okay, now I will get that degree, so I will have money. And if you think that you can top your field of expertise or of just a specialization of education by getting a degree and sticking to that and not making any other extra effort, well, you deserve, of course, not to work to be poor because you're just an idiot. and that's exactly the point. It always existed in the past. It's not like, the time of our parents or grandparents, working was necessarily easier in a human sense. I mean, that going to work, because that's the point. People are becoming weaker and lazier. That's fundamentally the issue. That's something that our parents, in all their limits, were better than us to do, and setting an example. At least I was very lucky for that. There are many fuck-ups also in the previous generations, but this is not the point. The point is that there is an evident disconnect from the notion. Probably you have to fatigue a lot in order to achieve something to begin with, all right? And this has a toll, and this shapes you in a certain way. And of course, especially the path of higher education is to be quite considered in this key. Although, by the way, some graduates face initial career challenges, there was no actual surplus in the way we intended, for different reasons. First of all, as we've seen, very few people were overall educated. Secondly, again, if you were educated, you were already well placed by status as a precondition for that. So despite the university's shortcomings, which reflected a certain disconnect in their curricula, degrees retained their social value. All right. There are, we've seen it in the videos about the history of law, different paths the different also national academies take at this point toward the Renaissance. The 15th century is still based on sort of individual thinkers, etc., but there are some currents that take on an ever more national character. And in these, you can easily recognize how, the purpose of these institutions is ever more political, in as much as they're ever more elite, right? So that's also where the criticism towards this establishment stems, probably in theoretical terms, in the content probably of their teaching. But that's also because they were involved in that sense, many important things that are not, and you shouldn't see, a scholar of effective 15th century just as a guy like you that it also severed from mostly higher places of political intervention, just being a person of lower social status in general. That has to live with it. These people were directly involved in so many other things at a time, and their education, if anything, just helped and was instrumental to that rather than the other way around, right? Rather than accepting the plausible but misleading idea of a devaluation of knowledge or educated individuals, it's more fitting to acknowledge this general rise, at least in the standardized cultural level, as we explained before, sort of more homogeneously shared and at the same time controlled to education that qualifies a specific establishment, sort of cultural background, and that is part of a this is essentially the great medieval civilization, partially shrunk, but also starting to, definitely not dead, and actually adding up different other elements to cope with the crisis, and essentially developing further in what we call the Renaissance, all right? This perspective better captures the developments of the 15th century and, of course, the following ones. Speaking of merit, by the way, despite declining papal patronage in some circumstances, rising studying costs, and restrictive regulation in some areas, there was some opportunity for really elevating yourself by status. But it just depends really on your context. For example, Gerson was the son of an Ardennes peasant. Nicholas of Cusa was the son of a Moselle boatman. This may be sort of exceptional context, but they're not strange. It really depends, again, on which path you followed. And again, given that education was functional, as we've seen, to other purposes, it was also, not easier to an extent, at least, for the time, to grow skilled in a particular art, in a particular field, especially if you were probably a learned man of letters, so you could exercise even just with your mind as a contemplative action, compared to people that in fact were, for example, more powerful. It could also, the monarchs did not want to make more powerful, and so someone coming from a lower rank and depending more on power would, for example, be a more faithful pawn, so to say. There are other examples. If you look at the previous century, Musatus, a famous Paduan humanist, this was also the son of a farmer and wrote basically the most learned work of his era. I've seen it in the video about Ezzalino, for example, because it's him who wrote the tragedy. Though that's a pre-humanistic, but also in the sense of a proto-humanistic world that was already that highly literary. You realize that also in the previous centuries, 12th, 11th, there had always been that level of actual higher education, like the notion that at some point it was just, some kind of barbaric past where nobody was educated or there weren't educational institutions in any point of the Middle Ages is nonsense, all right? It doesn't find any actual kind of evidence, it's just against what we know as the medieval civilization by definition. Significantly, nearly 1/5 of German university students in the 15th century were classified as paupers, so the poor, right? There were actual means to properly help to incentivize their education. We're talking orphans. The church, the clergy especially, had been created for that, creating this welfare system, educational programs, also for those, again, who criticize the church in general. And while it's true that, especially at least these poor German university students may usually not advance beyond the arts faculty and thus remain in the lower ranks of the secular clergy, it is also worth noticing that, of course, for people emerging from poverty, having even a job and an education of that kind was an insurance of enormous sort of protection, say, of an easier life, a better life than before. And imagine also all the implications of this from a moral and scientific point of view. How do you see the world if you're really brought up as a poor, as an orphan in 15th century Germany, right? How are you going to perform eventually as a priest, as a parish priest, and so on? These things do matter a lot, right? The nobility did not dominate educational institutions either, at least in direct participation. Their presence, if anything, for example, in universities, was proportional to their share of the broader population. This is very interesting, for example. This naturally stemmed from the fact that the nobility was not meant to pursue a contemplative lifestyle. They were involved in warfare, in government, even just by the fact that by extraction, they had been educated in that direction. They controlled people, lands, and so they were already minded for that specific purpose. Naturally, as you know very well, there were people who came from noble families and pursued an ecclesiastical career. In that sense, they were also covering the higher offices, because being a bishop, an archbishop, a cardinal, etc., was obviously continuing in part that kind of higher nobiliar lifestyle of controlling people and land and so on. So it required all a specific know-how, right? A technicality and awareness, some iron fist, some sound mind, some backbone, right? And this is what those people, generally speaking, had by extraction. So again, if you want to look at 15th century universities as today's university, well, of course, you can't quite probably picture the political and social difference between the two eras, or the cultural and moral one. In southern France, at the century's start, nobles made up only 1/20 of university students. At New College, Oxford, between 1380 and 1500, the figure was less than 13%, with most being gentry. However, the majority of students came from broad middle-rank social groups, predominantly rural England, which was also most of what England was, frankly. But I'm not kidding, but especially as far as, here we're talking about the southeast, but in fact, mostly the entire system revolved around London, right? And so that would have been kind of obvious. And again, England was a substantially different country from France. But for example, this difference, I don't know, in the background of these, the students would be, university students must be notably urban in the Italian peninsula and the empire. Sons of farmers, artisans, and tradesmen would experience what could be described as a bleak horizontal mobility of some sort. I mean, they would find their own place. It was still here a mean to promotion. It was not a crystallized society. It was not a Byzantine world. Of course, it was less easy, of course, than it had been a couple centuries before to get somewhere with an education. But at the time, for example, back, there were, for example, more opportunities even just outside of that. So what we see in this form of education is mostly, again, the mirroring of that specific hierarchy and order of society. Education offered a pathway from commerce or trade to roles in the clergy or administration, which provided greater security and prestige, as we just noticed, status security. Just again, imagine living in a monastery while, of course, if you live in a Protestant country, it's not exactly the problem where the place where you want to be. But in general, right, considering all the stormy events, right, you entered that life, and you could have also, like, it depends on the circumstances, but if you were a canon, if you had some, you could have even a full life. There were also ways to be, as you know, there were some orders that were not really contemplating vows. So you could be in between the world and these institutions. And so, I don't know, having children. And so that was developing in later Middle Ages exactly to shelter people from this perceivedly darker system. Cities in particular, where, as we've seen, the centers of most teaching were properly enshrined within city walls. They were part of a broader organic identity of orders, of estates, of communities, and so on. So it all corresponded to a very specific worldview and extraction, indeed. When we look at this university students, of course, they often began with financial resources and personal connections. Again, they were not the average person, really. However, through family, friends, or patrons, you could enter these institutions, find, again, an occupational opportunity that would essentially translate itself in a social shift of some kind. Sometimes coupled, by the way, with geographic relocation. As we've seen, the aforementioned scholars came from also relative peripheral areas, but they had found a fortune in the city, and certainly these greater institutions in the center. And so education and qualifications would enable this movement, as we've seen also across countries. Over time, true graduate dynasties formed even, reserved spots in top colleges, discounted examination fees. This is really the ancien regime taking shape. A doctor's son becomes a doctor, right? A lawyer's son becomes a lawyer. Think about even the cost of books, regardless of the print at this point. Like books cost a lot, right? And it meant a lot just to own one, right? Given that the same tradition, let's say, was sclerotizing, the same, Roman law now was being fixed by the various universities, etc. And there were, of course, always some liminal. We've seen it, made videos about 15th, 16th century and how everything was always changed. There were always new ideas and there were always new ways of looking at things. But there was, at the end of the Middle Ages, a fixed body of knowledge that mostly was preserved and just enriched. And this mostly throughout all the modern age, that's how things continued along that pattern. Also, most of the contemporary foundations are basically just a step further beyond the basis of that rather than something entirely new. So even in this material sense, books passing from father to son or uncle to nephew, creating cases or sub-cases of judges, lawyers, and teachers, whose learning and culture became a family tradition and inherited asset, would in many ways also make them competent, right? You would think that since, these people were just, booked, had a place booked in that field, like that there was no specific passion or selection. This is not true, because at the time, in order to study at university, you had to have a massive brain. You studied an enormous amount of things with the means of the time. A lot of stuff was done by heart. There were incredibly harsh exams. The ones of law were incredibly intense. Most people today absolutely do not have the cognitive ability to get themselves into a similar situation and succeeding. So again, don't think you're more intelligent or capable of a person who lived 600 years ago. In general, these people are made into that profession. Besides, of course, they will acquire practice even in this clientary system where, I don't know, if your father has always been working in that field, like you will receive someone that's just like in today's world, after all. You're going to be influenced by your family, your At this point, families are extended clans of some sort, right? Things are tending towards sort of more nuclear families historically, but in general, still powerful people in particular are truly part of a much more far-reaching community through their means than others. And they seek, especially in this time of increasing, again, elite blending, as we've seen it before from different backgrounds, to seek this higher connections and to increase their own, to concentrate their own wealth. And they are succeeding, by the way, also because of their education. And so we can see as an oversupply of graduates by the end of the Middle Ages, yet the schools and universities that developed at the end of the 15th century primarily enabled society to adapt to the changing political and moral landscape rather than fostering widespread social mobility. This does not mean, fortunately for the history of the West, that all the short and long-term consequences of the surge in education and learning were anticipated or controlled. However, it's also worth noticing that this system was, of course, a much more difficult one to leave than today. So what emerged also from these times is something that we shouldn't compare to our own, with the same purposes, with the same lens, with the same objectives, with the same standards, because the greatest challenge in history is arguably to also trying to see their view, that they see where they were coming from and why. This naturally is incredibly relevant when you also look at these aspects that are fundamentally so close to us. I mean, everybody can relate to an educational path, right? I personally that's what I'm all doing by specialization. My profession is basically a continuous education by definition, and of course producing, but in that sense, teaching, and but by explaining what I'm researching, what I'm finding out. And so obviously I've never really considered myself an intellectual nor a scholar, so to say, per se. But in that sense, it helps because even these people had, of course, a status, a value, a title, whatever, but they were mostly living a much fuller life. They were not probably even putting that in front of everything else. They were incredibly revered from that. Some would, I mean, at least as far as that social status connected with the title was concerned. But they also had much more going in their lives. And so that's mostly the thing that, especially when you consider the traditional way to education, you should consider. I don't know, that there is this idea, for example, that what widespread... I'm sorry I always make this sort of Anglo-American example as if I hated the Anglo-American word. Again, I explained this lots of times. This is not the case. But obviously I'm talking to a majoritarily Anglo-American and sort of kind of broader satellite kind of audience, and mostly conservatives, right? And I know that I have traditionalists among my followers that know what I'm talking about, but the notion, for example, that success comes only through, an economy, an economical lens, and say, you shouldn't study humanities, but thinking, by the way, it's not true that if you study economics, you become richer, actually, or other things. Like it turns out, at least it was a stat from, if at most a few decades ago from the United States, there were more millionaires among school teachers than lawyers, right? And it could be interesting to explain why, because this is the easiest way to... I'm not a school teacher, but I'll never be a school teacher. But the, let's say, the notion that, going back to the topic, the traditional elite, right, it was primarily humanistically educated. I mean, probably the people who took the field of battle were primarily educated in history, by the way, should make you really think about the entire picture, the entire circumstance, because you realize that there's evidently a divergent attitude in that regard. And unfortunately, this came around with specific again, cultural turns or subcultural turns, specific mindset with specific suggestions that people are simply grown into, but without, in fact, a historical explanation of why they happen to be that in the process, like depending where they come from, when they were born, to whom, and so on. And this is what history only can explain to you, at least if there is a lack of traditional fundamentals that in fact are difficult really to have also without a specific historical sensitivity. And again, it doesn't mean that you have just to study humanities or just to have that kind of background. You can go different ways. You can also be the super sort of broker kind of guy, absolutely nailing it, right? And that's very important too. And if anything, these people were invested in a bit all of this, right? They were. The point is in traditional discourses to be able to manage as much as possible. But the overall picture here is, of course, one of also, you can't do so much at a time, and especially in this more decadent historical times, so that one may have, let's say, the curiosity of imagining whether, what's the more preferential path or the most customized path or whatever. Many of you write me, for example, asking me about Schwerpunkt, like what should I do? And I started studying history recently. What's the best path? All these kind of things. It's difficult for me to answer, of course, without knowing you, of course. But there is definitely there is at least you may be different, and as we've seen, difference is not a positive thing. But in this sense, different subjects, as we have sort of created them, categorized them, are different in value as well. I mean, it is depending on what you do in them, of course, things can change and vary, and that's how different humanity gets down to be. And so how customized and sort of more or less jealous or proud of our sort of personality, our individualism, we tend to be. But the point is technically that different paths actually produce different people. And you should understand, perhaps, yes, where is that you're, from your fallen standpoint, you're better suited to come back to God through, which is evidently one of the paths over another. But never underestimate what you're doing through the path in this sense. So how there is obviously also an absolute value in the path itself, and you can't simply deny or disdain. Like, you must be cynically calculating some of the advantages in all the system, but you should also realize you can't get around major existential issues just by, thinking to have found the shortcut. You must really find your way and getting tuned on it so that you can eventually really sort of get the thing done well, your own way, but essentially improving yourself and becoming a different person. So it's interesting to have talked about medieval education, because I think I haven't made a specific video about that. I have something on universities, yes, but not on education. So we will have to fix this, because we can make a bigger playlist about the wall, and it's going to be more comprehensive. I don't know how often you look at properly at the playlists, but there are definitely lots of them, at least that tend to be the most watched, and then I create others just hoping that it's easier for others to find my channel. Traffic is what it is, but I noticed that there is a greater consumption. Probably, say, playlists really help, and so we're trying to make our best in this regard. It's strange how dynamics occur and happen. We have to be a bit more performing for sure, and again, share. As I was saying at the beginning of of this video. I make a test. I receive 500 votes in just like here. How much has it been? 11 hours. Those could have easily been 500 likes. We don't get. And so that's not a good place where to be, right? And we should be a bit more consistent in general with the participation with our doing, because the channel needs fresh resources. And if it doesn't go on, right, it's very difficult to make everything go the right direction. Again, let's hope that things sort of rise up once again. And I'm confident we can make it, but please, if you have to make a click, make it consistently for all the rest. You can't have, I don't know, channels in one day getting 30 likes and then getting 500 votes for a survey in half a day, right? Come on, right? If you really want to support the channel, if you really want to do something serious, share it, like it. It's useful, because the more the faster we get to the top, and the easier it will be for everybody involved. And the channel is not going to, but to improve, as a matter of fact. So, again, a scene from the survey. Again, the survey is very interesting. It says ancient history 28%, medieval 39%, modern 20%, and contemporary 14%. And if you sum modern contemporary, you get this is, I think, it's a pretty accurate depiction of the general distribution of eras in my channel, as a matter of fact. And what is interesting is that modern contemporary are superior to ancient, summed, right, and very close to be of interest. Also, say close to the 39% of medieval. So it's a very interesting partition of content, especially for a channel that has actually made a substantial amount of modern warfare content. Also, relatively few contemporary one. So I'm glad that there is, also from the comments, I was glad to read that you have different ideas, and it would be interesting to comment the outcome of the survey at some point, especially the comments, because they are, if anything, sort of the thing. Why haven't we talked about certain things? Why should we talk? There are a couple of suggestions, by the way, that are going to be satisfied soon, because I have actually already prepared some videos in series in those topics, namely the age of sail. Like there is, and I don't remember which other thing, I don't know, but Alexander too. Yes, I created something about him too as well. So, and I do realize that I've always realized since the beginning of Schwerpunkt, of course, what kind of gaps existed, and yeah, let's try to fill those, and let's keep the channel alive, right? As you come back from vacations, perhaps we're going to have better numbers. Let's make especially September usually the best month for, at least for me. It's been, I don't know whether for other YouTube channels, but still, right? You have really a lot of stuff incoming, really cool stuff. And there's a carrelade of specials just for September that are going to be probably a shock wave that we've never really seen. I've been escalating from in a couple of years just by means, quality, quantity, etc. We will get better over time. I see you enjoyed my video about, again, the master thesis series about the Battle of Markfield. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.